He masked his lands and title, and her yes changed everything. The drizzle that fell upon Alara Vance was as thin and persistent as her poverty, a constant, chilling reminder of a life lived on the precipice of ruin. It clung to the worn gray wool of her shawl and beaded on the loose strands of hair that had escaped her severe bun, each drop a tiny weight upon her already burdened shoulders. Before her, the cottage, with its sagging thatch and crumbling daub, seemed to sigh with the damp, a mirror to the exhaustion deep in her own bones. Inside, her father's cough was a percussive, painful rhythm, the only clock marking the slow passage of their dwindling days. The notice from the landlord, tucked beneath a chipped ceramic jar on the mantel, was a stark, black and white promise of homelessness. They had a fortnight. 14 days until the life they knew, meager as it was, would be swept away like soot from a cold hearth. This was her world, a landscape of muted colors, quiet desperation, and the fierce, protective love she held for the frail man who was her only family. He masked his lands and title, and her yes changed everything. Miles away, in a world of polished mahogany, roaring fires, and rain that only served to make the indoors feel more opulent, Alastair, the Duke of Blackwood, stared into the amber depths of his brandy. The glass was cool and solid in his hand, a stark contrast to the hollow ache that had been his constant companion for 3 years. Grief was a ghost that sat in every chair, its cold breath stirring the velvet curtains of Blackwood Castle. His first wife, Isabel, had been a creature of beauty and light, or so he had thought. He had discovered too late that her light was a reflection, cast by the gleam of his fortune. Her betrayal, a clandestine affair with a penniless officer, followed by her death from a swift fever, had left not just a wound, but a permanent, jagged scar across his soul. He was a duke, a man of immense power and responsibility, yet he felt like a king ruling over a wasteland of his own making. Now, his advisers, his aunt, the very weight of his lineage, pressed upon him. He must remarry. He must produce an heir. The duty was as unyielding as the granite of his castle walls. But the thought of bringing another woman into his life, of opening himself to that vulnerability again, was terrifying. How could he ever trust another? How could he discern genuine affection from the glittering, avaricious hunger he now saw in the eyes of every eligible lady presented to him? A bitter, desperate plan had taken root in the barren soil of his cynicism. A test. A cruel, perhaps, but in his mind, necessary deception. He would not seek a wife as the Duke of Blackwood. He would seek one as a man of modest means, a simple country gentleman. He would offer a life of comfort but not luxury, of security but not splendor. He would find a woman who would accept the man, not the title. And if he found such a woman, he would bind her to him before she ever learned the truth. His solicitor, a man whose face was a carefully constructed mask of professional discretion, was dispatched. He carried a proposal to the families of several impoverished but respectable young women, chosen for their quiet dignity and lack of connection to the avaricious circles of high society. The offer was from a Mr. Ashworth, a reclusive gentleman farmer with a small, unencumbered estate, seeking a companionable wife to share a quiet life. When the solicitor's carriage, impossibly grand and black against the muddy lane, stopped before the Vances cottage, Alara thought it was the landlord's agent come early. Her heart seized. But the man who stepped out was not the balding, officious Mr. Gable. He was tall, somber, and spoke in clipped, precise tones. He laid out the proposal on their rickety table, the thick parchment an alien object in the humble room. A marriage. To a stranger. A Mr. Ashworth she had never met. In exchange, her father would be provided for, a lifetime annuity, a comfortable cottage on the Ashworth estate where he could be tended by a proper nurse. Her father, frail but lucid, gripped her hand. No, Alara. I will not have you sold. But Alara saw not a sale, but a salvation. It was a choice between her pride and her father's life, and for her, that was no choice at all. She looked at the solicitor, her gaze clear and steady, the gray of her eyes reflecting the quiet strength that was her core. I will accept Mr. Ashworth's proposal, she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it sealed her fate. She would marry this stranger. For her father, she would do anything. Alastair received the news via a terse message from his solicitor. 2 candidates had refused outright. 1 had accepted. Miss Alara Vance. He read the name, the simple, unadorned syllables feeling foreign on his tongue. He felt a grim, hollow satisfaction. The first part of his test was complete. She had said yes. Now, the true deception would begin. He had no idea, as he stood in his grand library, surrounded by the trappings of his immense wealth, that her quiet, reluctant affirmative was not the end of his test, but the beginning of his own undoing. Alara's journey to her new life was a study in contrasts. The ducal carriage, though deliberately stripped of its most ostentatious crests, was still a vessel of impossible luxury. Its velvet squabs were a world away from the hard wooden bench of a farmer's cart, the only other vehicle she had ever ridden in. It carried her away from the familiar, damp landscape of her home, deeper into the rugged, untamed heart of the northern countryside. She watched the rolling hills give way to starker, more dramatic fells, the land growing wilder, more isolated. This was the domain of her Mr. Ashworth, a place of stone and wind and sky. Her heart, a small, frightened bird, beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was marrying a shadow, a name on a piece of paper, and traveling to a home she could not imagine. The carriage did not stop at a grand manor house, as some small, foolish part of her had secretly anticipated. Instead, it turned down a long, overgrown lane, finally halting before a sturdy but plain stone building. It was a hunting lodge, solid and unpretentious, nestled amongst a stand of ancient oaks. Smoke curled from a single chimney, a lonely gray ribbon against the vast, indifferent sky. This, then, was her new home. It was larger than her father's cottage, certainly, but it possessed a Spartan, almost neglected air. A man stood on the stone steps, watching the carriage approach. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed not in the fine clothes of a gentleman, but in the sturdy tweed and worn leather boots of a man who knew his own land. His face was stark, handsome in a severe way, with a strong jaw and eyes the color of a winter storm. A faint, silvery scar cut through one dark eyebrow, giving him a perpetually forbidding expression. As she stepped down from the carriage, he simply watched her, his gaze intense, analytical. This had to be him. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was deeper than she had expected, a low rumble that seemed to suit the landscape. There was no warmth in it. "I am Alastair Ashworth." So this was the man whose name now owned her future. He did not smile. He did not offer a comforting word. He simply gestured towards the door. "Mrs. Gable is inside. She will show you to your room." Inside, the lodge was clean but stark. The furniture was heavy, dark wood, built for durability, not comfort. The air was cool, smelling of wood smoke and beeswax. An older woman with a perpetually worried expression, Mrs. Gable, curtsied and led Alara up a creaking staircase to a small, plain room. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single wardrobe. The window looked out over a walled garden, choked with weeds and tangled rose bushes. It was the epitome of a simple, unadorned life. Alastair watched her from the hall below, his arms crossed over his chest. He saw her take in the plainness of it all, the lack of servants beyond the dour Mrs. Gable and a taciturn groundskeeper named Silas. He was waiting for the first sign of disappointment, the subtle curl of her lip, the flicker of disdain in her eyes. He expected complaints about the lack of a lady's maid, the chill in the air, the rustic simplicity of her new existence. This was his first, most crucial test. Isabel would have lasted less than an hour before descending into a fit of hysterics. But Alara did not complain. She thanked Mrs. Gable quietly, then turned back to the main room. She found him still standing there, a sentinel in his own home. "The journey was long, Mr. Ashworth," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, which she clasped tightly before her. "If you will excuse me, I should like to wash away the dust of the road." He merely nodded, his expression unreadable. She is playing a part, he thought, his cynicism a hard shield around his heart. She is biding her time. The performance will crack. But the performance, if it was one, was flawless. The next morning, Elara appeared in the kitchen, her sleeves already rolled up. Mrs. Gable, who was kneading bread with a look of grim determination, started in surprise. "Miss! What are you doing here? This is no place for you." "I cannot sit idle, Mrs. Gable," Elara replied, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time. "My hands are not made of porcelain. Please, show me what needs doing." Alastair, observing from the doorway, felt a strange, unwelcome stirring in his chest. He had expected her to spend her days sighing by the window or demanding entertainment. Instead, she was tying on an apron, her movements efficient and practical as she began to peel vegetables for the midday meal. Later that day, he saw her in the walled garden. She had found a pair of old shears in the potting shed and was methodically beginning to tame the riot of overgrown roses, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her hands, he noted, were not soft and pampered. They were capable, slender but strong, the hands of a woman who had worked her entire life. They were nothing like Isabel's hands, which had been tools for adornment and little else. He confronted her that evening as she sat by the hearth, her fingers gently massaging a new blister on her palm. The firelight cast flickering shadows across her face, softening the weary lines around her eyes. "You need not trouble yourself with the garden, Miss Vance," he said, his tone harsher than he intended. "Silas will see to it." She looked up, her gray eyes meeting his. They were clear, direct, and held no artifice. "It is no trouble, Mr. Ashworth. I find peace in it. It feels good to bring order to what has been neglected." The words were simple, yet they struck him with the force of a physical blow. Bringing order to what has been neglected. Was that not what he was trying to do with his own life, in his own brutal, misguided way? He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time not as a subject in his experiment, but as a woman. A woman of quiet grace and surprising resilience, who met a life of hardship not with complaint, but with a pair of gardening shears and a will to make things grow. The first hairline crack appeared in the thick wall of his cynicism. He had designed a prison to test her, but he was beginning to feel that he was the one who was truly trapped. Days bled into weeks, settling into a quiet, almost monastic routine. Elara and Alastair, or rather, Elara and Mr. Ashworth, lived under the same roof as near strangers, orbiting each other in watchful silence. He was a constant, brooding presence, his moods as unpredictable as the northern weather. He would spend hours away, riding across the fells, returning with the wild wind still clinging to his coat and a darkness in his eyes that she could not penetrate. Their conversations were brief, stilted affairs, confined to the necessities of meals and the running of the small household. Yet, slowly, Elara began to carve out a space for herself. The garden became her sanctuary. Under her patient hands, the choked beds began to breathe. She unearthed forgotten herbs, pruned the roses back to health, and planted neat rows of vegetables. The work was hard, her muscles ached, but the simple act of nurturing life from the soil was a balm to her bruised and uncertain spirit. It was a tangible accomplishment in a life that felt utterly formless. Alastair watched her from his study window. He saw the way she would gently touch a new leaf, the focused line of her brow as she pulled a stubborn weed. She was not performing for him, he knew this now. There was an authenticity to her labor, a deep-seated connection to the earth that he, a man who owned thousands of acres he barely glanced at, had never known. Each day she remained, each day she met her simple life with quiet acceptance rather than resentment, she chipped away at his certainty. He had been so sure of the duplicity of women, so convinced of their innate greed. Elara Vance was a walking, breathing refutation of his entire bitter thesis. The weather turned in the third week. The sky, which had been a clear, crisp blue, grew heavy and bruised. A fierce autumn storm rolled in from the coast, throwing sheets of rain against the lodge's thick stone walls and howling through the eaves like a vengeful spirit. The fire in the main hearth sputtered and smoked as the wind drove down the chimney. It was on the second night of the storm that the world seemed to shrink to the four walls of the lodge, trapping them in an enforced, suffocating intimacy. A loud crack, followed by the ominous sound of dripping water, startled them both from their silent vigil by the fire. A leak. And not a small one. Water was staining the ceiling in the corner of the library, directly above a shelf of leather-bound books. Quickly. Elara was on her feet before he was, her previous stillness replaced by decisive action. We must move the books. For the next hour, they worked together in a frantic, unspoken partnership. He, with his height and strength, climbed a small ladder to place buckets, while she, with a surprising swiftness, cleared the shelves, stacking the precious volumes safely in the center of the room. The storm raged outside, a wild chorus to their focused, domestic drama. As he handed down the last armful of books, his foot slipped on a wet rung. He fell awkwardly, catching himself against the edge of the bookshelf, his hand taking the brunt of the impact. A sharp, splintered piece of wood sliced deep into his palm. Ah! The curse was sharp, bitten off. Blood, dark in the lantern light, welled instantly, dripping onto the floorboards. Mr. Ashworth. You're hurt. Elara was at his side in an instant, her face etched with genuine alarm. She took his hand in hers, her touch surprisingly firm and steady. Let me see. He flinched, not from the pain, but from the contact. It had been years since a woman had touched him with such uncomplicated concern. Her hands, calloused from the garden but gentle, turned his own over, examining the gash with a practical eye. It's deep. We must clean it before it becomes infected. She led him to the kitchen as if he were a child, sitting him at the table while she fetched a basin of warm water, clean linen, and a small bottle of carbolic. He watched, stunned into silence, as she worked. Her movements were deft and sure. She cleaned the wound with a focused intensity, her touch impersonal yet profoundly caring. As she wrapped a clean strip of linen around his hand, her head was bent, a stray strand of brown hair falling across her cheek. He had the most overwhelming urge to reach out and tuck it behind her ear. The intimacy of the moment was suffocating. The scent of rain, of damp earth from her clothes, and the faint, clean scent of the soap she used filled his senses. He looked at their hands, his, large and now wounded, resting in her smaller, capable ones. For the first time, he felt the falseness of his disguise not as a tool, but as a chasm. This woman was caring for a wound on the hand of a man who did not exist. There, she said, tying the bandage neatly. She finally looked up, her gray eyes meeting his. In their depths, he saw no calculation, no hint of a scheme. He saw only a simple, humane compassion. And in that moment, the first major crack in his armor shattered. My mother, he found himself saying, the words emerging, unbidden, from a place he had long since sealed off. She had hands like yours. She could fix anything. It was a small, fragmented truth, but it was the first real thing he had offered her. He was not talking about the duchess his mother had been, but about the woman who had once bandaged his scraped knee as a boy. Elara's expression softened, a flicker of understanding passing between them. She saw past the brooding Mr. Ashworth for an instant, glimpsing a flicker of the lonely, wounded man beneath. A good skill for a mother to have, she said softly, her hands still resting on his. The storm howled outside, but inside the warm, lamplit kitchen, a different kind of quiet had fallen. It was not the silence of distance, but the fragile, tentative silence of connection. A seed of something genuine had been planted in the midst of his carefully constructed lie, and Alistair had the terrifying premonition that if it was allowed to grow, it would tear his entire world apart. After the storm, the atmosphere in the lodge shifted. The silence that had once been a barrier of suspicion and distance became something else, a shared space, filled with unspoken thoughts. The small, true thing Alistair had revealed about his mother had opened a narrow channel between them, and through it, a tentative current of understanding began to flow. He found himself seeking her company, manufacturing reasons to be near her. He would bring her a cup of tea in the garden, his bandaged hand a stark white reminder of the night the walls between them had first been breached. She would ask his opinion on where to plant the winter cabbages, her questions a quiet invitation into her world. Their conversations slowly expanded beyond the practical. They walked together in the afternoons, when the autumn sun cast long shadows across the fells. He learned that her father had been a schoolmaster, a man who loved books more than coin, and that she had inherited his quiet love of learning. She spoke of her childhood, not with self-pity for its poverty, but with a wistful fondness for its simple joys, pressed flowers, borrowed books, the smell of her father's pipe smoke. In turn, Alastair began to construct a more detailed history for Mr. Ashworth, weaving threads of truth into the fabric of his fiction. He spoke of a lonely boyhood, which was true, but attributed it to being an only child in a remote location, not to the cavernous, echoing halls of Blackwood Castle. He spoke of a past disappointment in love, framing it as a youthful folly with a flighty girl, a pale, sanitized version of the consuming betrayal that had nearly destroyed him. With every carefully edited anecdote he shared, a part of him ached with the dishonesty of it, while another, more desperate part, reveled in the connection it forged. He was showing her a piece of his soul, even if the frame was a lie. He began to test her in more subtle ways. He would leave a book of accounts on his desk, its figures detailing the modest but strained finances of the Ashworth estate. He watched to see if she would glance at it with a calculating eye. Instead, she once pointed to a line item for a new roof on a tenant farmer's cottage and remarked, "It is good that you were able to see to that before winter, Mr. Ashworth. The Watsons have so many little ones." Her focus was never on what he had, but on what was needed. Her moral compass was so fixed, so unwavering, it made his own deception feel increasingly monstrous. The persona of Mr. Ashworth, which had begun as a disguise, was starting to feel more real to him than the Duke of Blackwood. Mr. Ashworth was a man who worked with his hands, who worried over his tenants, who found pleasure in a simple, well-cooked meal and a quiet evening by the fire. He was a man who could earn the quiet respect of a woman like Elara Vance. The Duke, he realized with a growing sense of horror, could only buy it. The guilt became a constant, low-grade fever. He would watch her across the dinner table, the candlelight softening her features, and the urge to confess would be so strong it felt like a physical pressure in his chest. But fear always held him back. The affection he was beginning to see in her eyes was for Mr. Ashworth. What would be in those eyes if she saw the Duke? He imagined the warmth turning to ice, the trust to revulsion. He would lose her. And the thought of losing her, he was beginning to understand, was infinitely more painful than the loneliness he had been trying to escape. One afternoon, she found him in the small woodshed, splitting logs for the fire. It was something Silas usually did, but he had taken up the axe himself, needing the clean, physical work to quiet the turmoil in his mind. He worked with a fierce, rhythmic energy, the blade biting into the wood with a satisfying thud. Elara stood in the doorway, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "You will tire yourself out," she said, her voice gentle. He stopped, resting the axe head on the chopping block, breathing heavily. "The work is honest." "Yes," she agreed, stepping inside. She reached out and ran her fingers over the rough bark of a log. "It is what it is. A piece of wood. It does not pretend to be anything else." Her words, so simple and innocent, landed like a perfectly aimed blow. He looked at her, at the earnest clarity of her expression, and felt the full, crushing weight of his deceit. He was a lie, standing in a room filled with honest wood. He was a man pretending to be something he was not, to a woman who was more real, more true, than anyone he had ever known. He loved her. The realization struck him not with joy, but with the cold, terrifying certainty of a death sentence. He loved her, and he had built that love on a foundation of lies that was destined to crumble and bring everything down with it. The precarious peace of their isolated world was shattered by the unexpected baying of hounds and the distant call of a hunting horn. Alastair froze, his hand tightening on the book he was reading. He knew that sound. He knew the livery of the riders who would be crashing through his woods. It was Lord Bromley and his party, his nearest aristocratic neighbor, a garrulous man who would not think twice about seeking refreshment at the Duke of Blackwood's hunting lodge. "What is it?" Elara asked, looking up from her mending, her needle poised in mid-air. "Hunters," he said, his mind racing. He could not be discovered. "Not like this. Stay inside. I will see what they want." He strode out to the front of the lodge just as 3 riders emerged from the trees. At the lead was Bromley, his round face ruddy with exertion. His eyes widened in surprise and delight upon seeing Alastair. "Blackwood. By God, man, what are you doing hiding away in this rustic pile? I had heard you'd gone to ground, but this is taking it to an extreme." Alastair forced a thin smile, his entire body rigid with tension. "Bromley. An unexpected pleasure. I am overseeing some repairs." "Repairs?" Bromley boomed, dismounting. "Leave that to your steward, man. You should be with us. The hunt is magnificent today." He clapped Alastair on the shoulder, a gesture of casual familiarity that felt like a brand. At that moment, the door to the lodge opened and Elara stepped out, a basket of herbs in her hand. She stopped short, her eyes widening at the sight of the finely dressed gentlemen and their magnificent horses. Bromley's gaze swept over her, taking in her simple dress and work-worn hands. His expression was one of instant, dismissive appraisal. "Well now, Blackwood. Don't tell me the repairs include testing the new scullery maid." The insult, casual and cruel, landed in the quiet air like a thrown stone. Elara flinched, her face paling as she clutched the basket to her chest. Something inside Alastair snapped. The carefully constructed persona of the mild-mannered Mr. Ashworth evaporated, consumed by the cold, ancient fury of the Duke of Blackwood. His eyes turned to chips of ice. "Lord Bromley," he said, his voice dropping to a low, perilous register that made the other man's smile falter. "You are on my land. And you have just insulted my future wife. I suggest you choose your next words with the utmost care." The authority in his tone was absolute. It was not the voice of a gentleman farmer or a land steward. It was the voice of a man accustomed to unquestioning obedience, a man who could ruin another with a single, softly spoken word. Bromley stared, his jaw slack with shock. He looked from Alastair's thunderous expression to Elara's stunned face and back again. Your wife," he stammered, utterly bewildered. "Get off my land, Bromley," Alastair commanded, his voice lethally quiet. "Now." The Lord, for all his bluster, recognized a true threat when he saw one. He scrambled back onto his horse, muttering a flustered apology, and galloped away, his companions trailing in his wake. Silence descended, thick and heavy. Elara stood frozen, staring at Alastair. She had just witnessed a transformation. The quiet, reserved Mr. Ashworth had vanished, and in his place stood a stranger, a man of breathtaking arrogance and power. She had seen him command a nobleman as if he were a disobedient dog. "Who was that man?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" Panic flared in Alastair's chest. He had to salvage this. He had to put the mask back on. He turned to her, deliberately softening his expression, forcing the Duke back into his cage. "He is a pompous fool who owns the neighboring estate," he said, his voice strained. "He mistook me for my employer. I am the Duke's land steward, Elara. I manage this lodge, and all the lands you see." For him, it was a desperate, partial truth, a lie built upon a lie. I apologize for his rudeness to you. It was unforgivable." His defense of her had been fierce, magnificent. It had sent a thrill of gratitude and something more through her. But the explanation felt thin, wrong. The power he had projected was not that of a steward. It was the power of a master. She looked at him, at the turmoil in his stormy eyes, and a seed of profound doubt was planted in her heart. He had protected her, yes, but he had also revealed a glimpse of a man she did not know at all. The near exposure left Alistair profoundly shaken, the lie feeling like a threadbare coat in a blizzard. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that his time was running out. The incident with Lord Bromley left a palpable tension in the air, an unspoken question that hung between them. Ilara was quieter than usual, her gaze often distant, her brow furrowed in thought. She was trying to reconcile the two men she had seen, the quiet, brooding Mr. Ashworth and the powerful, commanding stranger who had dismissed a lord with a word. Alistair, meanwhile, was tormented. His impulsive defense of her had been a primal, instinctual act, proving to himself the terrifying depth of his feelings. He was no longer running an experiment. He was a man in love, trapped in a web of his own making. He knew he had to tell her the truth. But how? How could he confess his monstrous deception without destroying the fragile, precious thing that had grown between them? He felt as though he were holding a perfect, delicate bird in his hands, and any sudden movement would crush it. The fear of her rejection, of the look of betrayal he knew he would see in her eyes, paralyzed him. So he sought to strengthen the bond between them, to make it so strong that it might, by some miracle, withstand the coming storm of the truth. He let his own guard down, not just in small fragments, but in whole, vulnerable pieces. One evening, as they sat before the fire, the wind whispering outside, he found himself speaking of Isabel. Not her name, not the details, but the wound she had left behind. "I was married once," he said softly, staring into the flames. The confession hung in the air, heavy and momentous. Ilara turned to him, her mending forgotten in her lap. Her expression was one of infinite gentleness. She did not press, did not ask questions. She simply waited, giving him the space to speak. I believed it was a love match," he continued, his voice rough with unshed grief. "But I was wrong. I was valued not for who I was, but for what I could provide. The discovery of that, it hollowed me out. It made me doubt everything. Everyone." He finally looked at her, his eyes raw with a pain he had never shown another living soul. "Until you," he whispered. "You came here, to this simple place, and you asked for nothing. You have given nothing but kindness and grace. You have a goodness in you, Ilara, that I had ceased to believe existed." Tears welled in her eyes, not of pity, but of a deep, empathetic understanding. She saw the immense pain he carried, the profound loneliness that defined him. The pieces began to click into place for her, his reclusiveness, his initial suspicion, his need for a simple life away from a world that had hurt him. She did not see a land steward, she saw a man who had been deeply wounded and was trying to heal. She reached out, her hand tentatively covering his. "Alistair," she said, using his given name for the first time. It felt both strange and perfectly right. The past cannot be changed. But it does not have to be our future. He turned his hand over, his fingers lacing with hers. The contact was electric, a current of pure, unadorned emotion passing between them. The firelight danced in her eyes, and in their grey depths, he saw not just compassion, but affection. An affection for him. For the man he was pretending to be. He leaned in, drawn by an irresistible force. The world narrowed to the space between them, to the scent of wood smoke and the soft sound of her breathing. He raised his free hand, his fingers trembling slightly as he brushed a stray wisp of hair from her cheek. Her skin was soft, warm. He could see the pulse beating in the delicate hollow of her throat. "Ilara," he breathed, his voice thick with a longing that was almost painful. And then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of practiced seduction, but one of raw, desperate tenderness. It was a confession, a plea, a prayer. It was all the things he could not say, poured into a single, devastatingly honest touch. She did not pull away. After a moment of startled stillness, she softened against him, her lips responding with a shy, tentative warmth that shattered the last of his defenses. In that moment, kissing her by the fire in the rustic lodge, he was not the Duke of Blackwood. He was simply a man, flawed and broken, who had found an unexpected and undeserved grace. The kiss was the most exquisitely beautiful and painfully dishonest moment of his life. The dramatic irony was a knife twisting in his gut. He held in his arms the only woman he had ever truly loved, and she had no idea who he was. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this perfect, stolen moment was the calm before the inevitable, destructive storm. The fragile peace created by their kiss lasted for 2 perfect, stolen days. They existed in a bubble of shared glances, lingering touches, and the quiet joy of newfound intimacy. For the first time, Alistair allowed himself to hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, the love they had found could survive the truth. He resolved to tell her himself, to choose his own time, to explain his motives and beg for her forgiveness. He would do it tomorrow, he promised himself, clinging to one last day of this beautiful, counterfeit happiness. But tomorrow was not his to command. Fate, in the formidable shape of his aunt, Lady Beatrice, Dowager Duchess of Blackwood, arrived that afternoon. Her gleaming black carriage, emblazoned with the full ducal crest, was a jarring intrusion into their rustic world. It rolled up the lane like a war machine, and Alistair's blood ran cold. Lady Beatrice was a woman forged from duty and aristocratic steel. She had governed his household since his mother's death and viewed his self-imposed exile as a dereliction, his experiment a dangerous and undignified folly. Having heard the garbled but alarming tale from a chastened Lord Bromley, she had come to put an end to it. She swept into the lodge without knocking, her silks rustling in disapproval at the simple furnishings. Her sharp eyes found Alistair and Elara standing by the hearth, their hands still loosely linked. Elara had been telling him about a robin that had taken up residence in the garden, a small, happy anecdote that died on her lips as she took in the imperious figure in the doorway. Lady Beatrice's gaze raked over Elara, dismissing her in a single, contemptuous glance. Then she fixed her eyes on her nephew. "Alistair," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "Enough of this foolishness. You will dismiss this person and return to Blackwood at once. The Danvers girl is visiting. Her connections are impeccable." Alistair felt the blood drain from his face. He stepped in front of Elara, a protective but ultimately futile gesture. "Aunt Beatrice, you will not speak to her that way. This is my intended wife." Lady Beatrice let out a short, sharp laugh devoid of all humor. "Intended wife? Do not be absurd. She is a subject in your bizarre little test. A commoner you have decided to toy with to soothe your wounded pride. Your Grace cannot possibly be serious. Your Grace." The words dropped into the quiet room like stones into a still pond, the ripples spreading outwards, shattering everything. Elara's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with dawning horror. She stared at Alistair, truly seeing him for the first time, the innate authority, the way he stood as if he owned the very ground beneath his feet, the cold fury in his eyes that was not the anger of a steward but the wrath of a duke. The Duke of Blackwood. The reclusive, fabulously wealthy, and powerful nobleman whose lands these were. It was all a lie. Every word, every shared confidence, every moment of vulnerability. Mr. Ashworth did not exist. He was a fiction, a cruel puppet, and she had been his gullible audience. The man who had spoken of his lonely boyhood was a duke who had grown up in a castle. The man who had claimed to value simplicity was a master of immense, unimaginable wealth. The kiss, that tender, beautiful kiss, was not a moment of connection, it was the pinnacle of his deception, the final act of his callous experiment. "No," she whispered, the word a breath of pure agony. She backed away from him as if he were suddenly engulfed in flames. "Elara, let me explain," Alistair pleaded, taking a step towards her, his hands outstretched. "Explain." Her voice rose, laced with a pain so profound it was almost a shriek. "Explain what?" "That my life, my father's security, my very heart, were all just pieces in your cynical game. You wanted to see if a poor girl could be content with a simple life before you revealed the grand prize." Her laugh was a broken, terrible sound. Was I a satisfactory specimen, Your Grace? Did I pass your test? It was not like that, he insisted, his desperation growing as he saw the warmth in her eyes replaced by a shattered, glacial emptiness. It began that way, but it changed. I changed. Everything I felt for you, everything we shared, was real. Real? She shot back, tears streaming down her face now, hot and furious. Nothing was real. You are not real. The man I thought I knew is a ghost, a lie you invented to manipulate me. You did not trust me enough to show me your true face, so you do not get to claim any part of my heart. Lady Beatrice watched the scene with a thin, satisfied smile. You see, nephew? Blood will out. Give her a purse and send her on her way. It's more than she deserves. The final, cruel dismissal was the last straw. With a choked sob, Elara turned and fled. She ran from the room, from the lodge, from the man who had systematically destroyed her. Alistair made to follow, but his aunt's voice stopped him, sharp as a whip. Let her go. She is nothing. He spun on his aunt, his face a mask of such cold rage that even she took an involuntary step back. She is everything, he snarled. And you, and I, have just lost her. He finally ran after Elara, but he was too late. He burst out the front door into the fading afternoon light to see her already halfway down the lane, a small, solitary figure running away as if the hounds of hell were at her heels. And in a way, they were. The hell was of his own making, and he was its sole, damned inhabitant. Elara ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, collapsing onto the damp grass at the side of the road, miles from the lodge. The world was a blur of tears and ragged breaths. The betrayal was a physical entity, a living thing with claws, tearing her apart from the inside. Every memory of the past weeks was now tainted, poisoned by the truth. His gentle touch, his quiet confessions, his protective fury, all of it had been a performance. He was not a wounded man seeking solace, he was a powerful aristocrat amusing himself with a life-size doll, testing its settings before deciding whether to keep it. She would not be kept. Her pride, the only true possession she had left, rose from the ashes of her heartbreak. She would not take his money. She would not be his duchess, a prize he had won in a rigged game. She would go home. She would find a way to care for her father. She would scrub floors or take in sewing, she would do anything before she would accept one more thing from the Duke of Blackwood. She stood on shaky legs and began the long, arduous walk back to her own world, leaving the fantasy, and the man who had authored it, behind forever. Back at the lodge, Alistair turned on his aunt with a fury that terrified her. He banished her from his sight, from his lands, telling her that if she ever interfered in his life again, he would cut her off completely. He then stormed through the silent, empty rooms of the lodge. The place that had begun to feel like a home now felt like a mausoleum. Her scent lingered in the air, the book she had been reading lay open on a table, a half-finished cup of tea sat cooling on the mantel. Every object was an accusation. He sank into a chair by the cold hearth, the full weight of his actions crashing down on him. He had set out to prove that all women were deceitful, and in the process, he had become the most deceitful man of all. He had sought to protect his heart from being treated like a commodity, only to treat Alara's as a thing to be tested and judged. The irony was so bitter it choked him. The loneliness that returned was 100 times more potent than what he had felt before. It was a despair born not of grief, but of shame. He had found a woman of true worth, of unparalleled integrity and kindness, and he had deliberately, methodically, destroyed her faith in him. He had not been testing her character, he had been revealing the profound lack of his own. The hollow ache in his chest was no longer a scar from an old wound, it was a fresh, gaping chasm of his own creation. For days, he remained at the lodge, refusing to see anyone, refusing to eat, haunted by the memory of her shattered face. He had won his cruel wager with the world and lost the only thing that had ever truly mattered. The castle was a tomb, but this small lodge was his hell. He knew he had to do something, but the path forward was obscured by a fog of self-loathing. He had to earn her back. But how could one earn back a trust that had been so utterly and fundamentally betrayed? The Duke of Blackwood, with all his power and wealth, had never felt so utterly powerless. After a week wallowing in a mire of despair and self-recrimination, a sliver of clarity pierced Alistair's gloom. He could not undo his deception, but he could, perhaps, atone for it. He could not be the man Alara thought he was, because that man never existed. But he could strive to be a man worthy of her. And that man would not command, or buy, or demand. He would serve. He left the lodge, not in his ducal carriage, but on a simple horse, dressed in the sturdy, plain clothes of Mr. Ashworth. He rode to her village, a place so modest it was barely a speck on his own maps. He saw her from a distance, carrying a bucket of water from the village well, her back straight, her movements weary but resolute. The sight of her, so proud and so burdened, was a knife to his heart. He approached her cottage that evening. He did not knock. He simply stood outside the gate until she emerged to bring in firewood. When she saw him, she froze, her face hardening into a mask of cold fury. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of all emotion. Alara, he had rehearsed 100 speeches, but the words died in his throat before the sheer wall of her pain. "I am sorry." "Sorry?" She gave a short, bitter laugh. "You are sorry you were caught. There is a difference. Your Grace has no business here. Please leave." She turned to go back inside. Mr. Ashworth never existed, she threw over her shoulder before shutting the door firmly in his face. The finality of it was like a physical blow. He stood there for a long time, the closed door a symbol of her closed heart. He could leave. He could return to his castle and his empty life. Or he could prove her wrong. He could prove that some part of Mr. Ashworth, the honest, caring part she had brought out in him, was real. He did not leave the village. He took a room at the local inn, a place of rough-hewn tables and suspicious stairs. And he began to work. He learned that the village's small grist mill, the primary source of employment for many families, had fallen into disrepair, its owner lacking the funds to fix the main grinding stone. The entire community was teetering on the edge of financial ruin. Through a solicitor in a distant town, Alistair anonymously provided the capital. He didn't just pay for the repair, he invested in a new, more efficient water wheel, ensuring the mill's prosperity for a generation. He watched from a distance as the men returned to work, their faces filled with a relief and joy that gave him the first flicker of peace he'd felt in weeks. Next, he learned the truth of her father's situation. The cottage they had lived in was owned by a merciless landlord who was indeed planning to evict them. Alistair purchased the entire debt, not just for the Vances, but for 3 other struggling families in the village. He had the deeds drawn up and delivered by a local boy. Alara received a crisp, legal document stating that the cottage and the small plot of land it stood on were now hers, free and clear, the gift of an anonymous benefactor. He did all of this quietly, without fanfare, using his wealth not as a tool of power, but as an instrument of quiet restitution. He was healing the community she loved, protecting the people she cared for. It was a courtship in reverse. He was not trying to win her with trinkets, but by proving he understood what she truly valued: security, community, and the well-being of others. Finally, after a month had passed, he approached her again. He found her in her own small garden, the one she had started behind the cottage. She was on her knees, tending to a row of late-season greens. She looked up as his shadow fell over her, and this time, she did not immediately turn away. She saw the change in him. He was thinner, his face etched with a weariness that went bone-deep, but the arrogance was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet, humble resolve. "The mill is running again," she stated, her voice soft. "The Websters and the Prices own their homes now. That was you, it was not a question." He nodded, his throat tight. "I did not do it to buy your forgiveness, Alara. I did it because it was the right thing to do. I did it because the man you made me want to be would have done it." He knelt in the dirt before her, heedless of the mud on his fine trousers. You were right. Mr. Ashworth was a lie. A coward's invention. But the man who fell in love with you at the lodge was real. The heart that broke when I hurt you is real. I cannot take back the deception, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to atone for it. But I love you. Not as a duchess, not as a prize, but as you are. Elara Vance. The strongest, kindest, most honorable person I have ever known. He held out his hand, not to pull her up, but as a simple offering. I am not asking you to be my duchess. I am asking you to let me be your husband. We can live in the lodge. We need never set foot in the castle again. We can live the life I pretended to have, but we will live it for real. Please. Give me a chance to be the man you deserve. Tears streamed down her face, but this time, they were not tears of anger or betrayal. They were tears of a heart that had been broken and was slowly, tentatively, beginning to heal. She looked at his outstretched hand, then into his eyes, and she saw the truth of his transformation. He was no longer hiding behind a mask. He was laying his scarred, broken soul bare for her to see. And in his vulnerability, she finally found the truth she had been searching for. She placed her hand in his. It was a gesture of immense, terrifying trust. Alistair, she whispered, the name a promise. I think we can plant a garden there. A proper one this time. Their return to Blackwood was not a triumph of a commoner marrying a duke, but a quiet homecoming of two people who had found each other through a labyrinth of pain and deceit. Elara's condition was simple: they would begin their life together at the hunting lodge. The grand, oppressive castle, a symbol of the power and status that had created the chasm between them, would remain empty for now. Alistair agreed without hesitation. He would have agreed to live in her father's tiny cottage if it meant having her by his side. They were married in the village church, a simple ceremony attended by her father, whose health had improved remarkably with the peace of mind his daughter's security had brought him, and a handful of the villagers whose lives Alistair had quietly mended. There were no lords or ladies, no silken banners, no ducal fanfare. It was a marriage not of two titles, but of two souls. Life at the lodge was a gentle, deliberate act of rebuilding. They worked side by side in the garden, their hands often touching as they reached for the same tool or weed. The garden became a metaphor for their relationship, a neglected plot they were nurturing back to life, one day at a time. The work was honest and grounding, stripping away the artifice of their past and leaving only the truth of their shared present. In the quiet evenings, they learned each other anew. Elara learned about the immense pressures and profound loneliness of Alistair's position, the weight of 1,000 years of lineage on his shoulders. She began to understand, if not condone, the desperate fear that had driven him to his deception. He was not just a duke, he was a man who had been taught from birth that his title was his only true value. He, in turn, discovered the depths of her strength and wisdom. She was not intimidated by his status, because she had fallen in love with the man, not the mask. She taught him to see his lands not as a portfolio of assets, but as a community of people whose lives depended on his stewardship. She had a practical, compassionate intelligence that cut through the sycophantic advice he had received his entire life. He found himself relying on her counsel, valuing her perspective above all others. She was not just his wife, she was his partner, his conscience, his heart. Slowly, she began to coax him back towards his duties, not as the reclusive, bitter Duke of Blackwood, but as a new kind of leader. They began to spend a few days a week at the castle, but on their own terms. Elara insisted the kitchens prepare extra food to be distributed to the poor on the estate. She turned one of the vast, unused ballrooms into a lending library for the staff and tenants. Her quiet, unassuming grace won over the skeptical staff far more effectively than any aristocratic command ever could have. She was not playing the part of a duchess, she was simply being herself, and in doing so, she redefined what a duchess could be. The castle, once a cold monument to Alistair's grief and isolation, began to fill with warmth and life, reflecting the healing of its master. The hearts that had long been cold were now roaring with fire. An epilogue, written in the quiet moments of their shared life, unfolded over the next few years. Her father lived out his days in comfort and peace in a cottage near the lodge, visited daily by his daughter and the Duke who had become like a son to him. Lady Beatrice, humbled and repentant, was eventually welcomed back into their lives, her imperious nature softened by the genuine happiness she saw in her nephew and the undeniable goodness of his wife. One crisp autumn afternoon, 5 years after their wedding, Alastair and Elara stood in the garden of the hunting lodge. It was a riot of color and life, a testament to their patient labor. A small boy with his father's stormy eyes and his mother's determined chin chased a butterfly through a patch of late-blooming roses, while Elara held a baby girl in her arms. Alastair came to stand behind his wife, wrapping his arms around her and their daughter. He rested his chin on her shoulder, breathing in the familiar, beloved scent of her hair and the damp earth. "Do you remember," he murmured, his voice soft against her ear, "what you said to me the first time I saw you in this garden? You said you found peace in bringing order to what had been neglected." She leaned back against him, her hand covering his. "I remember. You did more than that, my love," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that time had not dimmed. "You brought order to me." He had masked his lands and his title, a desperate gambit born of pain and cynicism. He had expected to test a stranger, but had instead been forced to confront the truth of himself. And her yes, that one quiet word, spoken in desperation from a crumbling cottage, had not just answered a proposal. It had changed everything. It had dismantled a duke, saved a man, and built a love far more real and valuable than any title or fortune. In the quiet triumph of their shared life, surrounded by the family they had made and the garden they had grown, he was finally, truly, home.